Professor Nolan Pierce had spent 12 years making powerful alphas lower their voices around him. So the first man who made his own pulse stumble became a problem he intended to eliminate immediately. At 34, Nolan had perfected the art of intimidation without ever raising his voice. He stood at the front of Hawthorne University's largest lecture hall in a charcoal suit, one hand resting beside a stack of research notes, while nearly 200 students maintained the kind of silence usually reserved for courtrooms. "Mr. Bennett," Nolan said, fixing a broad-shouldered alpha in the third row with a level stare. "Would you like to reconsider that answer?" Bennett swallowed. "Yes, Professor." "Good choice." A few students hid smiles. Nolan turned toward the projection screen, satisfied that order had been restored. Then something unfamiliar reached him. A scent, subtle but impossible to ignore, cut through coffee, dry erase markers, and old textbooks. Nolan's fingers stopped against the remote. His heartbeat gave one hard, traitorous thump. Impossible. He continued speaking, but the sensation remained, calm and persistent, like someone knocking on a locked door. Nolan finally looked toward the back row. Ethan Calloway was sitting there. Even Nolan recognized him. Everyone did. Ethan was the Enigma whose interviews had appeared everywhere after his groundbreaking work on secondary gender genetics made him a national celebrity. Enigmas were rare enough. Ethan was rarer still, brilliant, wealthy, publicly charming, and apparently incapable of being intimidated. While everyone else watched Nolan's slides, Ethan watched Nolan. Worse, he smiled when their eyes met. Nolan continued the lecture for another 20 minutes through sheer discipline. When class ended, students escaped into the hallway with remarkable efficiency. Ethan remained seated. Nolan gathered his papers. "Mr. Calloway, Professor Pierce, is staring considered professional behavior where you work?" Ethan rose, buttoning his navy jacket. "Usually people are too busy staring at me to notice." Nolan's expression hardened. "Then consider this a new experience." Ethan laughed softly and walked down the steps. Nolan disliked how relaxed he looked. He disliked the curious warmth in his brown eyes even more. Most of all, he disliked that strange scent growing clearer with every foot Ethan crossed. Nolan's body recognized something his mind refused to name. Ethan stopped several feet away. "Interesting. What is?" "You." Nolan's jaw tightened. "That wasn't an invitation." "I know." Ethan's teasing expression faded into something more thoughtful. "That's why it's interesting." Nolan stepped behind his desk, putting furniture between them and hating himself for noticing he'd done it. "If you're here about the research partnership, my office hours are posted online. Actually, that's exactly why I'm here. The university assigned us to the same project." Nolan stared at him. Of course they had. "I'll request reassignment." "Already tried." Ethan lifted his phone. "Dean Caldwell says we're apparently perfect for each other." Nolan's glare could have frozen Lake Michigan. Ethan grinned. "Professionally, Professor. Relax. Get out." Ethan turned toward the door, but stopped beside Nolan on his way past. For 1 second, the humor disappeared from his face. His voice lowered. "You really don't know, do you?" Nolan looked at him sharply. "Know what?" Ethan hesitated, studying him with an intensity that suddenly felt nothing like flirting. "Your scent changes whenever I get close." The room seemed to become unnaturally quiet. Nolan had been tested repeatedly. Alpha. Dominant. Stable. Predictable. There was nothing mysterious about him. "You're mistaken." "Maybe." Ethan backed toward the doorway. "But Professor?" Nolan said nothing. Ethan's gaze held his. "I've met hundreds of alphas." The faint smile returned, but this time there was concern behind it. "None of them ever reacted to an enigma the way you just reacted to me." Then Ethan walked away, leaving Nolan alone in the empty lecture hall, staring at the doorway while his pulse refused to return to normal. By 9 the next morning, Nolan had convinced himself that Ethan Calloway was wrong, which would have been far more convincing if Nolan had not spent half the night researching Enigma biology. He arrived at Hawthorne University with 4 hours of sleep, 2 cups of black coffee, and absolutely no patience for surprises. Naturally, Ethan was waiting outside his office. He wore a dark blue coat over a crisp white shirt, looking less like a visiting researcher and more like someone accustomed to entering rooms where important decisions were made. 2 faculty members passing through the hallway recognized him immediately. Ethan greeted them politely, then returned his attention to Nolan as though nobody else existed. "You are early," Nolan said. You sound disappointed. I am. Ethan smiled. Good morning to you too. Nolan unlocked his office. We have 90 minutes. We will review the project requirements, divide responsibilities, and maintain professional boundaries. Ethan followed him inside. You prepared rules. I prepare for everything. Except me, apparently. Nolan stopped. Ethan raised both hands peacefully. Professional boundaries. Understood. The university project was larger than Nolan had expected. Federal researchers had supplied anonymized biological data from thousands of adults across the country, and Hawthorne wanted Nolan's expertise in alpha genetics combined with Ethan's rare knowledge of Enigma markers. Reassignment was impossible without delaying the study for months. Nolan hated that almost as much as he hated discovering that Ethan was genuinely brilliant. For the next hour, Ethan dropped the teasing completely. He found inconsistencies Nolan had missed, challenged two assumptions without arrogance, and suggested a model elegant enough that Nolan silently rewrote 3 pages of notes. That was dangerous. Attraction could be dismissed. Respect was harder. You are staring again, Ethan said without looking up. Nolan immediately returned to his laptop. I was thinking. About me? About replacing you. Ethan laughed, and against Nolan's better judgment, the corner of his mouth almost moved. Almost. Over the following week, forced collaboration became routine. Ethan appeared every morning with coffee. Nolan repeatedly told him to stop. Ethan repeatedly ignored him. They argued over methodology, citation standards, office temperature, and whether Nolan's habit of skipping lunch qualified as a personality defect. Yet Ethan never crossed the boundary Nolan had drawn. When Nolan stepped away, Ethan gave him space. When Nolan became quiet, Ethan stopped joking. The restraint unsettled Nolan more than flirting would have. Friday night found them alone in the genetics building after a winter storm emptied campus early. Snow covered the windows, and the heating system hummed against the cold. Nolan stood beside a laboratory table reviewing a sequence when the room suddenly tilted. He caught the edge of the table. Nolan. Ethan's voice changed instantly. No teasing. Nolan straightened. I am fine. You are gripping that table like it owes you money. I said I am fine. He took one step and his knees weakened. Ethan moved forward, then stopped himself several feet away. Can I touch you? The question struck Nolan harder than the dizziness. Ethan could have simply grabbed him. Instead, the most powerful enigma Nolan had ever met stood perfectly still, waiting for permission. Nolan swallowed. Yes. Ethan crossed the distance and steadied him by the arm, careful and controlled. The strange scent returned immediately, followed by warmth beneath Nolan's skin. Ethan felt him tense and loosened his grip. I am calling campus medical. No, that was not a request. Nolan looked up sharply. Do not order me around. Then consider it aggressive concern. Despite himself, Nolan almost laughed. The sound never came. Another wave of dizziness forced him into the nearest chair. Ethan crouched several feet in front of him rather than looming overhead. This has happened before, has it not? Nolan looked away. That was answer enough. An hour later, campus medical was nearly empty. Nolan sat on an examination table while Ethan waited outside because Nolan had insisted. The physician returned holding laboratory results, her expression carefully neutral. Professor Pierce, your hormone profile has changed significantly since your last physical. Nolan frowned. Changed how? She hesitated. I want to repeat the tests before drawing conclusions, because according to your records, this should not be biologically possible. Nolan felt the room go cold. Through the narrow window in the door, he could see Ethan sitting alone in the hallway, elbows on his knees, waiting. For the first time, Nolan remembered Ethan's warning without dismissing it. His scent was changing. His body was changing. And somehow, every impossible result had begun the moment Ethan Calloway walked into his lecture hall. Nolan received the second set of results at 7:42 Monday morning, and by 7:45, someone else already knew. He was standing alone in his office when his phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. You should be more careful about who sees your blood work, Professor. Nolan read it twice, then deleted it without answering. 3 minutes later, Ethan walked in carrying 2 coffees and stopped smiling the instant he saw Nolan's face. What happened? Nothing. You have a very specific expression when nothing happens. Ethan placed the coffee down. Nolan hated that Ethan could already read him. He hated even more that part of him found it comforting. Before he could respond, voices gathered outside. When Nolan opened the door, he found several faculty members and 2 student reporters lingering in the hallway. One reporter stepped forward. "Professor Pierce, is it true you experienced an alpha instability episode on campus Friday?" Nolan went perfectly still. Ethan did not. He stepped beside Nolan, calm enough to make the entire hallway quiet. "Professor Pierce experienced dizziness after working late during a snowstorm," Ethan said. "His private medical information is not a campus news story." The reporter glanced between them. "Why were you with him at the clinic?" "Because we are partners." Silence. Nolan slowly turned his head. Ethan seemed to realize how that sounded approximately 1 second too late. "Research partners," he clarified. Someone at the back laughed. Nolan wanted the floor to open. Instead, he folded his arms. "If everyone has finished discussing my personal life, some of us have actual work." The crowd scattered with impressive speed. Inside the office, Nolan shut the door. "Partners. It worked. Half the department now thinks we are dating." Ethan considered that. The other half probably thought that already. Nolan stared at him. "You are enjoying this." "A little." Then Ethan's expression softened. "But I meant what I said. Nobody gets to turn your medical condition into entertainment." The sincerity landed somewhere Nolan was not prepared to examine. His phone vibrated again. Same unknown number. Being protected by an enigma will only make them more curious. Nolan locked the screen too quickly. Ethan noticed. Of course he noticed. "Who is texting you?" "Nobody." "Nolan, do not use that tone." "What tone?" "The one that implies you intend to become involved." Ethan leaned against the desk. "I am already involved." Their eyes held for one uncomfortable second too long. Nolan looked away first. That irritated him. By lunchtime, photographs of Ethan accompanying Nolan to campus medical had reached social media, and Hawthorne's communications office requested a meeting. Their proposed solution was absurdly simple. Since Ethan was already publicly attached to the research project, they wanted both men to attend Wednesday's donor reception together, present a united professional front, and refuse questions about Nolan's health. "So we pretend everything is normal," Nolan said afterward. Ethan adjusted his cuff. "For 2 hours. We stay together, smile for cameras, and let people assume whatever they want. You smiling may make the situation less believable." Nolan gave him a flat look. Ethan grinned. There he is. Wednesday evening, a black luxury sedan waited outside Nolan's apartment. Nolan stopped on the sidewalk. A driver opened the rear door, and Ethan emerged wearing a tailored black suit. Another man remained near the vehicle, scanning the street with practiced attention. "You brought security?" Nolan asked. Ethan's smile disappeared. "I always have security at public events." "Why?" "Being recognizable has disadvantages." Ethan offered his hand, then seemed to remember Nolan's boundaries and lowered it. Nolan noticed something he had never seen before. A heavy silver ring on Ethan's right hand, engraved with an unfamiliar crest. That ring. Ethan immediately covered it with his other hand. "Too late. Family thing. You never mentioned your family. You never asked." Before Nolan could press him, the security man approached and quietly handed Ethan a phone. Ethan read the screen. Every trace of warmth vanished from his face. Nolan had seen Ethan amused, concerned, brilliant, even protective. He had never seen him dangerous. "What is it?" Nolan asked. Ethan looked toward the building across the street, then back at him. "Someone accessed your medical file again 10 minutes ago." Nolan's stomach dropped. Ethan opened the car door. "Tonight, stay beside me." Nolan should have objected. Instead, he stepped closer. "For appearances?" Ethan's eyes met his. "That is what we will tell everyone else." The donor reception had been designed to celebrate scientific achievement, but Nolan realized within 5 minutes that half the room had come to study him instead. Conversation softened when he passed. Eyes followed him over champagne glasses. Ethan stayed beside him without touching, close enough to suggest solidarity, but never close enough to make Nolan feel trapped. It should have felt performative. Somehow it did not. "Professor Pierce." Nolan recognized the voice before he turned. Dr. Marcus Vale stood behind him, immaculate in a gray suit, wearing the same polished smile Nolan remembered from the 18 miserable months they had dated. Marcus had been charming in public and relentlessly critical in private, always insisting Nolan was too rigid, too ambitious, too difficult to love. Marcus glanced toward Ethan. So the rumors are true. Rumors rarely are. You disappear from faculty events for months, then arrive attached to the most famous Enigma in the country. People are going to wonder. Nolan's shoulders tightened. Ethan calmly sipped his sparkling water. People with interesting lives usually have better things to wonder about. Marcus blinked. Nolan almost smiled. Almost. I was speaking to Nolan. And I was answering you. Ethan's voice remained pleasant. That somehow made it sharper. Marcus turned back to Nolan. I heard about your episode. You should be careful. If your biology is becoming unstable, the department may question whether you should still oversee graduate research. The words were quiet, but several nearby conversations stopped. Nolan felt every stare land on him. He had survived academic rivalries, funding battles, and 12 years of people waiting for him to fail. This felt different. Medical uncertainty had turned him from authority into spectacle. My health is none of your concern, Nolan said. Marcus gave him a sympathetic look that felt worse than an insult. I am only saying what everyone is thinking. No, Ethan said. The room seemed to narrow around that single word. He set down his glass and stepped beside Nolan. You were saying what you were thinking, then hiding behind everyone else because it sounds less cruel that way. Marcus's smile vanished. Ethan continued with perfect calm. Professor Pierce's research record is exceptional. His students have one of the highest completion rates in the department, and the project you are discussing cannot proceed without his expertise. If anyone here intends to challenge his competence based on private medical information obtained without permission, they should be prepared to explain that decision formally. No threat, no raised voice. Just facts delivered with enough precision to make Marcus glance toward the university president across the room. You seem unusually invested, Marcus said. Ethan looked at Nolan before answering. I am. 2 words. Nolan's pulse stumbled again. Marcus excused himself soon afterward, suddenly remembering someone important across the ballroom. Nolan waited until they reached a quiet hallway before turning on Ethan. You did not have to do that. I know. Then why did you? Ethan studied him. Because he was trying to make you ashamed of something you do not even understand yet. I can defend myself. I know that too. Ethan's expression softened. Standing beside you is not the same as believing you cannot stand alone. Nolan had no immediate response, which was becoming an irritating pattern around Ethan. His phone vibrated. Another unknown message appeared. Ask Calloway why his family funded the original Enigma trials. Nolan's blood ran cold. He slowly lifted his eyes. Ethan had turned toward the ballroom, and under the chandelier light, the silver family ring gleamed on his hand. Ethan. Something in Nolan's voice made him turn. Nolan held up the phone. For the first time since they met, Ethan looked genuinely shaken. Tell me that is not true. Ethan was silent for 3 seconds. 4. Then he glanced toward the crowded reception and lowered his voice. Not here. Nolan stepped back. So it is true. It is complicated. That is what people say when the simple answer is bad. Ethan looked toward his security detail, then back to Nolan. My family funded research decades ago. I have spent years trying to find out what happened inside that program. Nolan's anger faltered. Why? Ethan hesitated. Because my name is not the only one connected to it. He reached inside his coat and removed a folded document. Nolan recognized the Hawthorne Medical Archive seal immediately. Ethan opened it just enough for Nolan to see a date from 34 years earlier and one familiar surname. Pierce. Nolan forgot the ballroom. Forgot Marcus. Forgot every whisper around them. Where did you get that? Ethan folded the paper again. This is why I came to Hawthorne. Nolan stared at him as the truth shifted beneath his feet. Ethan had protected him publicly like a partner, looked at him privately like something dangerously close to more, and all along he had been carrying a secret with Nolan's name on it. Nolan did not speak to Ethan again until the reception was over. He walked through the hotel lobby with the folded document clenched in one hand, ignoring the curious looks that followed them. Ethan stayed several steps behind, close enough to protect him and far enough to respect the distance Nolan had created. Outside, cold Chicago air cut through Nolan's coat. The black sedan waited at the curb. I am not getting into your car until you tell me who you really are, Nolan said. Ethan stopped. His security detail quietly moved away. Ethan Calloway is my real name. That was not my question. Nolan held up the document. You came to Hawthorne because of me. Partly. You knew my family was connected to those trials before you ever Walked into my lecture hall. Ethan's silence answered first. Nolan laughed once, without humor. Unbelievable. I did not know what the connection meant. But you knew there was one. Yes. That single word hurt more than Nolan expected. He remembered the coffee, the late nights, Ethan asking permission before touching him, Ethan standing beside him while Marcus tried to humiliate him. Every moment Nolan had reluctantly allowed himself to trust now seemed to have another explanation. Was any of it real? Nolan asked. Ethan's expression changed. All of it. Convenient answer. Nolan. Professor Pierce. Ethan went still. The correction landed exactly where Nolan intended. You do not get to use my first name right now. For several seconds, traffic whispered over wet pavement behind them. Then Ethan removed the silver ring from his finger. My family founded Calloway Biogenetics. Nolan knew the name. Everyone in their field did. The company controlled laboratories, patents, and medical research centers across the country. Ethan had always been described publicly as a celebrated independent Enigma researcher. Nobody mentioned that he belonged to one of America's most powerful biotechnology families. You are the heir, Nolan said. Yes. Nolan stared at him. The luxury car, the security, the ring. Suddenly none of it looked mysterious. It looked obvious. My grandfather financed the original Enigma adaptation program, Ethan continued. Officially, it studied compatibility markers. Unofficially, parts of the program crossed lines that should never have been crossed. Records disappeared when the project was shut down. Nolan looked at the paper again. And my name? Not yours. Your mother's. Nolan stopped breathing for half a second. Ethan continued carefully. She participated in a prenatal study while pregnant with you. According to the surviving records, researchers identified an unusual genetic marker, then buried the result. Nolan's anger sharpened into something colder. You knew this before my hormone levels changed. I knew a marker existed. I did not know what it could do. And you decided to study me personally. No. Ethan stepped closer, then stopped when Nolan moved back. Pain flashed across his face. I came to Hawthorne looking for records. Meeting you was not planned. Yet you recognized my scent immediately. I recognized that something was unusual. That frightened me. Nolan almost laughed again. You expect me to believe the famous Enigma heir accidentally meets the son of a participant in his family's secret research, becomes his partner, protects him publicly, and develops feelings along the way. Ethan's eyes held his. When you say it like that, it sounds terrible. Because it is terrible. Nolan's phone vibrated. He looked down. A message from Campus Medical filled the screen. Professor Pierce, your repeat testing requires immediate follow-up. Please contact Dr. Reynolds tonight. Nolan closed his eyes. Not now. What happened? Ethan asked. Nothing that concerns you. That is not true. It needs to become true. Nolan handed the old document back. Ethan did not take it. Keep it. You deserve every record I have. I wanted honesty. Nolan's voice dropped. Not evidence after you were caught. Ethan looked as though he wanted to argue, but did not. You are right. That somehow made Nolan angrier. He stepped toward the curb and ordered a rideshare on his phone. Ethan glanced at the dark street. At least let my driver take you home. No. Someone accessed your medical records twice. And apparently I have been standing beside someone who had access to secrets about me before I did. Ethan flinched. Nolan hated that he noticed. He hated that part of him wanted to take the words back. His ride arrived 4 minutes later. Before Nolan opened the door, Ethan spoke behind him. There is one thing you need to know. Nolan turned. The person leaking your medical information is not working for me. How can you possibly know that? Ethan's face became unreadable. Because they sent me a message too. He held out his phone. Nolan read the words on the screen and felt the anger inside him collide with fear. Stay away from Pierce, or we release the original file. Nolan looked up. Ethan had been hiding the truth, but someone else was hiding something bigger. What original file? Nolan asked. Ethan's answer came quietly. That is what I have been trying to find for 6 years. Nolan made it exactly 20 minutes after getting home before Dr. Reynolds called and told him to sit down. That was never a promising beginning. Your hormone levels have shifted again, she said. I want you back tomorrow morning for additional testing. Until then, rest, eat something, and please do not ignore dizziness. Nolan looked at the untouched dinner in his refrigerator. I never ignore medical advice. Dr. Reynolds was silent. Professor Pierce. Fine. Occasionally. After the call ended, Nolan stood in his dark kitchen while rain tapped against the windows. He should have been thinking about his test results. Instead, he kept seeing Ethan's phone and that message. Stay away from Pierce. Nolan hated uncertainty. He hated betrayal more. Yet beneath both was an uncomfortable truth. Ethan had been threatened too. At 11:17, someone knocked. Nolan checked the security camera and nearly cursed. Ethan stood outside in pouring rain, holding a paper bag in one hand and an umbrella that had clearly surrendered several blocks ago in the other. Nolan opened the door, but did not invite him inside. How did you find my address? University directory. That is unsettling. I brought soup. Nolan stared at the bag. That does not make it less unsettling. Dr. Reynolds called me. Nolan's eyes narrowed. She did what? You listed me as your emergency contact Friday night because the nurse needed someone to drive you home. Ethan looked almost apologetic. Apparently you forgot. Nolan had. That somehow made everything worse. She only said you needed someone nearby tonight. No details. Ethan held out the bag. Take the soup. I will leave. Nolan should have accepted that offer. Instead, he noticed Ethan's soaked coat, tired eyes, and the absence of his usual effortless smile. You look terrible. Ethan blinked. That may be the nicest thing you have said to me. Nolan stepped aside. 10 minutes. Ethan entered. 10 minutes became 30 when Nolan discovered the soup was from a diner he liked near campus. 30 became an hour when another wave of exhaustion forced him onto the couch. Ethan did not fuss. He simply placed water on the coffee table, moved to the opposite chair, and remained there. You do not have to watch me, Nolan muttered. I am not watching you. You have looked at me 6 times in 2 minutes. 7. Nolan glared. Ethan smiled faintly, then the expression disappeared. My father used to count too. Nolan looked over. Ethan was staring at the rain. Count what? Mistakes. Interviews. Public appearances. Every sentence that might embarrass the Calloway name. His fingers turned the silver family ring slowly. When I presented as an enigma, I stopped being his son and became an asset. Rare genetics. Good publicity. Useful connections. Nolan had never heard Ethan sound bitter before. Is that why you became a researcher? Partly. I wanted to understand what they thought gave them ownership over my life. Ethan removed the ring and placed it on the table. My grandfather built an empire around studying people like me. My father wanted me to inherit it without asking questions. I started asking. And they let you? Ethan gave a humorless laugh. They tried to control my funding, my schedule, even who I could trust. Eventually, I learned that being powerful and being free are not the same thing. Nolan studied him. Suddenly, the security detail, the polished public image, even Ethan's constant humor looked different. Armor could take many forms. You said you have searched for that file for 6 years. Yes. Alone. Ethan hesitated. Mostly. There it was. Not arrogance. Loneliness. Nolan understood that language too well. Why did you protect me at the reception if doing so puts you against your family? Ethan looked directly at him. Because when Marcus spoke about you like your biology erased everything you accomplished, I knew exactly what that felt like. Nolan's anger did not disappear. Trust did not repair itself because someone brought soup in the rain. But something inside him softened anyway. I am still furious with you. You should be. I do not trust you. Ethan nodded. Then I will earn it. No argument. No charming smile. Just patience. Nolan looked down and realized his hand was trembling slightly from exhaustion. Ethan noticed too, but he did not move toward him. He waited. After a moment, Nolan extended his hand across the space between them. Ethan stared at it. Help me up. Ethan crossed the room and took it carefully. Warm fingers closed around Nolan's, steady without controlling. Nolan stood, but neither man immediately let go. Their eyes met. For one quiet second, all the secrets and suspicion seemed very far away. Then Ethan's phone lit up on the table. A new message appeared beside the abandoned family ring. Stop searching, Mr. Calloway. Professor Pierce is already changing. This time, Nolan saw it too. By Tuesday afternoon, Nolan understood why public humiliation was more effective than any private threat. Hawthorne had called an emergency faculty meeting in the university auditorium, supposedly to address the unauthorized release of confidential medical information. Nolan arrived expecting administrators and department chairs. Instead, he found reporters outside, students filling the rear seats, and Marcus Vale standing near the stage with the expression of a man who already knew how the story ended. Ethan entered beside Nolan but stopped when his phone rang. "Give me 1 minute," he said quietly. Nolan nodded and walked inside alone. That was his first mistake. The university president had barely opened the meeting when every phone in the auditorium began vibrating. Nolan heard whispers spreading row by row. Then the enormous presentation screen behind the stage changed. A photograph appeared. Nolan and Ethan outside the donor reception, standing close beside the black sedan. Another photograph followed, showing Ethan entering Nolan's apartment during the rainstorm. Then came screenshots of messages. "Professor Pierce knows exactly what he is doing. Keep the public partnership believable until we secure access to the archive." Nolan stared at Ethan's name above the messages. His stomach dropped. More screenshots appeared, supposedly showing Nolan discussing media attention, research funding, and the value of being publicly connected to the Calloway heir. They looked convincing. They were also lies. "Turn that off," Nolan said. Nobody moved quickly enough. Marcus rose from the front row. Perhaps Professor Pierce should explain why his private relationship with the heir to Calloway biogenetics began at the same time his research project received national attention. Nolan looked at him. "There is no private relationship to explain." A reporter called from the back. "Were you pretending to be involved with Mr. Calloway to protect your position?" Another voice followed. "Did you know he was the Calloway heir before the donor reception?" The questions multiplied. Nolan felt the room closing around him. The arrangement had never been romantic, but they had deliberately allowed people to make assumptions. Now that ambiguity had been transformed into evidence that Nolan had manipulated Ethan for status. Marcus approached the microphone. "These messages suggest Professor Pierce cultivated a relationship with Mr. Calloway while concealing a personal medical condition directly relevant to their research." Nolan's face went cold. "Those messages are fabricated." "Then Mr. Calloway can confirm that." Every head turned toward the auditorium doors. Ethan stood there. He had returned sometime during the leak. His face was unreadable. Nolan waited. 1 second. 2. 3. Ethan said nothing. Something inside Nolan sank. Of course. Ethan had a corporation, a family name, and billions of dollars in reputation behind him. Nolan was one professor surrounded by questions nobody understood. For seconds. 5. Nolan forced himself to look away. He would not beg anyone to defend him. Then Ethan walked forward. Slowly, calmly. The room became silent as he reached the stage. He did not look at Marcus. He looked only at Nolan. "I am sorry," Ethan said. Nolan's chest tightened. Ethan turned toward the audience. "I was deciding how much of my family's private history I was willing to expose today." Marcus stiffened. Ethan continued. "Apparently, the answer is all of it." He placed his phone on the podium. "Those screenshots are fake. My security team traced the original files 15 minutes ago. The messages were assembled from unrelated communications and altered to make Professor Pierce appear opportunistic." Murmurs erupted. Ethan waited until they stopped. "Professor Pierce did not pursue me. He did not know I was the Calloway heir. In fact, when he discovered I had concealed that fact, he told me to stay away from him." Nolan stared. Ethan's voice remained controlled, but something personal entered it. "If anyone benefited from our association, it was me." Nolan Pierce gave this project credibility before he knew my family name. He challenged my work when everyone else was too impressed by that name to disagree with me. Marcus interrupted. "That does not explain the photographs." Ethan finally looked at him. "There is nothing scandalous about bringing soup to someone who is sick." A few people laughed nervously. Ethan did not. "And there is nothing shameful about standing beside someone while strangers discuss his body as if it belongs to the public." Nolan felt the words hit deeper than he wanted them to. Ethan faced the cameras. "If you need a Calloway to blame, blame me. My family funded the research connected to Professor Pierce before he was born. He is not exploiting my name. My name has been exploiting people like him for decades." The auditorium went completely still. Ethan reached into his coat and placed the silver family ring beside the microphone. "Effective today, I am suspending my role as successor to Calloway Biogenetics until every surviving record from the original program is released." Nolan forgot how to breathe. Ethan had not merely defended him. He had chosen Nolan over the inheritance that had defined his entire life. Then Dr. Reynolds appeared at the side entrance, pale and carrying a sealed medical envelope. Her eyes found Nolan immediately. "Professor Pierce," she said, "I need to speak with you privately. Your final results came back." Nolan looked from her to Ethan. The scandal suddenly felt distant. Dr. Reynolds lowered her voice, but Nolan heard every word. "The changes are progressing much faster than we expected." Dr. Reynolds led Nolan into a small conference room behind the auditorium and closed the door before handing him the envelope. Ethan followed only after Nolan gave a silent nod. "The genetic marker we found is active," Dr. Reynolds said carefully. "Your hormone profile is no longer presenting within standard alpha parameters." Nolan stared at the laboratory report without understanding half the numbers. "What does that mean?" Dr. Reynolds took a breath. "It means the symptoms are not temporary. We need imaging and additional testing immediately." Before Nolan could answer, the auditorium outside erupted with voices. Ethan checked his phone. His expression hardened. "Marcus is telling reporters Nolan falsified his medical disclosures." Nolan laughed bitterly. "Of course he is." Ethan looked toward the door. "Stay here." Nolan stood. "Absolutely not." 5 minutes later, Nolan walked back into the auditorium beside Ethan and Dr. Reynolds. Cameras turned toward them instantly. Marcus remained at the podium, speaking about ethics and undisclosed conflicts. Ethan walked straight toward the stage. "Dr. Vale, before you continue accusing Professor Pierce of dishonesty, perhaps you should explain why your university credentials were used to access his confidential file." Marcus froze. Ethan connected his phone to the presentation system. A security report appeared on the screen, showing timestamps, access logs, and authentication records. "My team traced the breach through 3 servers," Ethan said. "The final access originated from a faculty account registered to you." Marcus recovered quickly. "Accounts can be compromised." "Correct. Which is why we checked the security footage." A still image appeared showing Marcus entering a restricted faculty office at the exact time of one breach. The room exploded into whispers. Ethan remained calm. "Then we found the original messages used to create those fake screenshots." Side by side, the audience could see ordinary research conversations beside the altered versions. Words had been removed, rearranged, and combined. The supposed conspiracy collapsed in seconds. Marcus stepped away from the microphone. "This proves nothing about Pierce's intentions." "His intentions?" Ethan repeated quietly. "Professor Pierce did not even know my family controlled Calloway biogenetics until 3 days ago. He wanted our public appearances kept professional. I was the one who agreed to let people assume more because I believed it would shield him from invasive questions." Nolan turned toward him. Ethan continued before anyone could interrupt. "Yes, part of what the public saw was an arrangement. We stood together because the university wanted a unified image. We let rumors work in our favor because we thought that would protect the research and Professor Pierce's privacy." Cameras flashed. Ethan looked directly at Nolan. That part was not real. Nolan's heart sank for exactly 1 beat. Then Ethan stepped away from the podium. But somewhere between arguing over research models, bringing him coffee he repeatedly told me he did not want, and sitting in his apartment while he pretended he was not exhausted, something changed. Nolan forgot the crowd. Ethan's voice softened. "My concern for him is real. My respect for him is real. And whatever happens after today, I will not stand here and pretend my feelings are part of some public relations agreement." Absolute silence filled the auditorium. Nolan could hear his own heartbeat. Marcus tried once more. How touching. Convenient timing from the Calloway heir. Ethan removed a document from his coat. Former heir. He placed it beside the family ring. "This is my signed resignation from the Calloway Biogenetics Succession Board, effective this morning. I surrendered voting control of my inheritance shares to an independent trust until the original research program is fully investigated." Even Marcus had nothing to say. Ethan faced the cameras. "So let me make this extremely simple. I am not protecting Nolan Pierce because he benefits my family. Choosing him may cost me my place in it." Then he turned to Nolan, and suddenly the powerful Enigma, who could silence an auditorium, looked almost uncertain. "I should have told you everything from the beginning. I cannot change that. But I can stop hiding now." Nolan felt hundreds of eyes on him, yet Ethan did not reach for him or demand an answer. He simply stood there and let Nolan choose. That mattered more than any declaration. Nolan crossed the distance himself and took Ethan's hand. The auditorium erupted, but Nolan barely heard it. This does not mean I have forgiven you, he murmured. Ethan's relieved smile appeared. I would have been worried if you had. Dr. Reynolds approached them through the noise, still holding Nolan's medical envelope. Her expression was stunned, but this time there was something gentler behind it. Professor Pierce, we completed the imaging while the laboratory confirmed your results. Nolan's fingers tightened around Ethan's. Just tell me. Dr. Reynolds smiled faintly. There are 2 heartbeats. Nolan stared at her. Ethan stopped breathing beside him. 2. Nolan whispered. Twins, she said. The entire world seemed to fall silent again, and for the first time since everything began, Nolan did not pull his hand away from Ethan's. For several seconds, Nolan could only stare at Dr. Reynolds while the word twins rearranged every plan he had ever made for his life. Beside him, Ethan remained completely still. No triumphant smile. No claim. No assumption that this news automatically gave him a place in Nolan's future. He simply held Nolan's hand because Nolan had chosen not to let go. Are they healthy? Nolan finally asked. Everything we can see right now looks encouraging, Dr. Reynolds said. You will need close monitoring because your biology is unusual, but today, I am giving you good news. Nolan released a breath he had apparently been holding since the first abnormal blood test. Ethan's thumb moved once across his knuckles, so gently Nolan almost missed it. 2. Ethan whispered. Nolan looked at him. The famous Enigma, who could command boardrooms and silence reporters, looked genuinely overwhelmed. Do not faint, Nolan said. Ethan blinked. I was about to tell you the same thing. Nolan laughed. It escaped before he could stop it, quiet and tired and real. Cameras were still waiting outside, but for once, Nolan did not care. The university investigation moved quickly after Ethan released the evidence. Marcus was removed from the research project while Hawthorne opened a formal review of the privacy breaches. Calloway Biogenetics agreed to turn the surviving records from the original program over to independent investigators, largely because Ethan's resignation had created the kind of public pressure his family could no longer ignore. Nolan eventually received his mother's complete file. The truth was less simple than he feared. She had entered what she believed was an ordinary prenatal study. The unusual marker discovered in Nolan had been concealed afterward, not from her, but from regulators who would have questioned how far the research had gone. For 34 years, Nolan had believed his biology was perfectly understood. Now he knew it had never been allowed to be understood honestly. 3 weeks later, he returned to his lecture hall. Nearly 200 students went silent when he entered. Nolan placed his notes on the desk and surveyed the room. Before anyone asks, yes, I am medically cleared to teach. No, my private health is not extra credit. And anyone attempting to photograph me during class will discover how creative I can become with midterm questions. Every phone disappeared. Nolan almost smiled. At the back of the room, Ethan was waiting. Nolan stopped. Why are you here? You forgot lunch. Ethan lifted a paper bag. Several students suddenly became fascinated by their notebooks. Nolan walked toward him. You crossed Chicago to bring me a sandwich. And soup. You have a problem with soup. You have a problem accepting care. Nolan considered arguing, then took the bag. Thank you. Ethan looked surprised. I should have recorded that. Leave while you still have tenure-adjacent privileges. Ethan grinned, but Nolan caught his hand before he could turn away. This time, Nolan did not care who saw. Later that evening, they stood by the windows of Nolan's apartment while snow drifted over the city. On the table sat no public relations agreement, no research contract, and no family document. Just a single sheet of paper Ethan had jokingly titled Terms for an Actual Relationship. Nolan read the first line aloud. Rule 1. No secrets. Non-negotiable, Ethan said. Rule 2. No pretending medical advice is optional. Nolan crossed it out. Ethan looked offended. Absolutely not. My contract. My amendments. Our contract. Nolan paused at that word. Our. His gaze dropped instinctively toward his stomach, still unchanged enough that the reality sometimes felt impossible. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. He had become very good at waiting. Nolan put down the pen. I am still angry about what you hid from me. I know. Trust will take time. I know that too. And I do not need a protector. Ethan nodded. You never did. Nolan studied him. But I might want a partner. Ethan's expression softened. That position available? Conditional approval. Very romantic. Nolan stepped closer and rested his forehead briefly against Ethan's. I am trying. So am I. There was no audience now, no university watching, no Calloway family deciding what Ethan should become. When Nolan kissed him, it was brief and gentle, less a dramatic confession than a quiet answer they had both earned. Ethan smiled afterward. Does this mean the fake part is officially over? There was never a fake boyfriend agreement. Tell that to half of Chicago. Nolan took Ethan's hand and placed it carefully over his stomach. Nothing happened at first. Then Ethan's eyes widened. Nolan felt it too, faint but unmistakable. A tiny movement. Then another. Ethan looked at him with such astonishment that Nolan laughed again. Outside, the city glittered beneath fresh snow. Inside, two men who had spent years being defined by power, biology, family, and expectation finally had something that belonged only to them. A choice. Nolan intertwined their fingers and whispered, "Stay." Ethan did, and for the first time in Nolan Pierce's carefully controlled life, forever did not sound like a threat. It sounded like home.